Hello. Welcome, you guys. I apologize for my absence. I had a little bit of a hospital stay with COVID, and my oxygen levels have arisen enough for me to get out back home. I'm going to split test one into two, if you don't mind, just to kind of uh, acclimate my lungs to speaking. Um, so at any rate, the beginning of test one for this week, okay? It's kind of an amalgamation of our argumentative assignments and the textbook, all right? And just try to get you familiar with the basic discourse on the first two subjects, which are chronologically Native Americans before the arrival of the Europeans, as well as the Spaniards, right? Or also known as the Black Legend, Spanish colonization. So notice with number one, it's straight out of number one on your argumentative assignment, and so we talk about the degree to which science is limited, right? The degree to which science is limited in its ability to infer that which we believe has happened, has been accomplished, etc., by by Native Americans before Columbus's arrival. So we talked about a scarcity of written sources, right? Remember the stelae and the codices that have been written pictographically. Those are primarily found in Central America and not in the present day United States territory. So there's a scarcity of primary sources. We talked about the different methods used, right? In number one, radiometric carbon 14 dating, tree ring dating, isotope analysis, stratigraphy, and number one talks about the limitations of those methods, right? As far as being able to discern with a feeling of certainty that which has happened prior to the arrival of Europeans. Let's see here. The European Chronicles, those are European writers coming here and writing about their observations, and they would try to orally, like an early anthropologist, try to gather data about the Native Americans' tribal pasts and hear oral stories about that. And they're obviously limited in what they can prove, right, regarding those. And not to mention, they're bringing their own Eurocentric, their own ethnocentric bias to the accounts, and whether they mean to or not, many would argue. And so, at any rate, so just be familiar with that thesis on number one, right? And we talked about the limitations of that. One example was C. Vance Haynes' thesis, all the way up through the early 90s. It was taken for granted from the 50s through the early 90s that Native Americans came about 13,000 years ago across the land bridge of Beringia, right, during the Wisconsin or latest ice age. And but then they find evidence, of at Monteverde in Chile and Bolivia, down by Tiwanaku, etc., where they carbon dated remains that were older than 13,000 years old, and where they found a very little carbon footprint through the ice-free corridor that they were supposed to have traveled through. So there's a lot of unanswered questions to this day, right? And then even the cultural, linguistic, and biological ties between Siberia and Native Americans that was mentioned in number one. Notice that has not been sufficiently convincing to some in academia. All right, and so then moving on to number two is just remember that there's kind of an anthropological narrative whereby there's this belief, right? And this could be refuted at any time, but there's this belief that there's a general pattern of cultural human evolution from more simple society to more complex society. Okay, that's very arguable, but it still kind of permeates academia and how we look at Native American society, assuming that they have progressively become less and less, quote, simple in their organization. So the idea of hunter-gatherers and small bands during the Pleistocene era, then during the Archaic period, they start to farm in smaller communities, But then they're going to require more and more laborers. And then once you begin farming, you become reliant upon sources outside your control, like the weather, etc. So you develop a religious elite. You have to develop a military elite to coerce the labor and also to protect your crops from someone coming in during harvest time and taking them from you. Then you don't need everyone to farm, and so you have the opportunity to form a complex society of like skilled workers or artisans, merchants trading something from your community to the next, and so hence the development of complex society. According to the book 1491 by Charles C. Mann, knowing that the Americas were isolated by two oceans, they did a pretty darn good job in the narrative as far as when they came about with these inventions. And not to mention, he also makes the argument, right, is that why is that even fair that they have to play this European game to be up to par to European standards so as to not warrant being dispossessed in their own land? That's a whole other can of worms. All right. But notice, right, according to the narrative, it's not necessarily the ecosystem that was the first area of complex society being developed, as far as the evidence seems to lean, is when you look up and down, of course, the Mississippi Delta is fertile, but they still believe that unless there more comes out about the Adena people, the Southwest for the longest time has been kind of crowned the earliest area to reach this, quote, complex organizational status, right? So the Pueblo natives, right, down in New Mexico, Arizona, in the Four Corners area of the Southwest. Matter of fact, there's so many ties to Mesoamerica that's just it. As some people believe that the ties are cultural or even demographic, people moving up there from Mexico itself. So at any rate, right, just kind of the basic narrative there. Let's see here. Number 3, that's the last one on your argumentative assignment. What did the Native Americans share that helped bring about a Eurocentric kind of disdain or arrogance directed toward Native Americans? And it namely revolved around private property and religion, right? So we talked about animism, shamanism, polytheism, pantheism. All right, those are just stated, and if you don't mind, just to save my breath, those are described very briefly, but described in the handout, and I'm going to save my air on those. But that's what you're looking for as far as with number 3, the focus upon that thesis, okay? So please keep that in mind. Number 4, very simple question about the two, kind of seemingly, they seemingly contradict each other, but they kind of dovetail, and that is the stereotypes of the European chroniclers of Native Americans either being childlike and innocent, right, ovejas mansas, meek sheep, or being bestial savages, right? And so, so again, I'm not really excited about giving this format of a test. I really prefer the argumentative assignments. I think it's so much better for your critical thinking and so much more in light of the complexity of these things. So I try to qualify my questions here, okay? But let's see here. And then moving on to number 5, the Black Legend, right? What are the adjectives according to, trying to make the Spanish as an anti-model as far as how they treated Native Americans. So we talked about hierarchical, their society being inequitable. We talked about them being greedy and brutal. We talked about them being very ethnocentrically zealous with their religion and imposing Catholic Christianity on Native Americans, them kind of bringing that whole Reconquista zeitgeist with them across the Atlantic that they were fighting back in Spain proper. And so, all right. And so you have that on one of your numbers on the Black Legend argumentative assignment. And then let's see here. And then we talked about with number 6, right, is like numbers 1 on the Spanish handout and number 1 on the Southern Colonies handout, right? The idea of mercantilism starting to morph into capitalism, whereby it's no longer all economic opportunities and resources were just allocated from above by the crown, him or herself, but now things are opening up to the taker, whoever's willing and able to come and conquer land, come and find new land and claim it and Christianize it, etc. Right? So, kind of simplistically, I had in the argumentative assignment the assertion that it's kind of an early barbaric kind of Darwinian form of capitalism. That was opening up private enterprise, competition, private property, somewhat. Although you held your title in socage, you held it in the name of the crown. So not completely, up to par by today's standards with capitalism, but definitely leaning away from mercantilism from the get-go in somewhat of a brutal fashion, with that somewhat blank check that was offered to the conquistadores, to the conquerors, right? Who would come forward as adelantados or go forward as conquerors, as conquistadores, and forcing the Native Americans to become Catholic Christian. All right. And they would be entitled Hidalgo status, so many lands, and encomienda, forced labor under them, etc., etc. All right. Let's see here. Number 7, what were some contributions? I get that from J.H. Eliot in his book on Empires of the Atlantic World. Very good book on England and Spain colonizing in the early modern era, namely like the 1600s. So from there, right, you have the monotheistic Christian God and Christianity, right? The Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. You have notions of Germanic and Roman law, where it comes to like reciprocity, paying for putting they called it the weregild, putting amount of compensatory amount on a person's life and damage done to him or her or his or her property. Just a lot of notions of early modern law the Spaniards brought with them. They brought, like I said, Christianity, Western civilizations, notions of property and law, okay, Roman and Germanic sources, private property, urban development. Spanish, as Alan Brinkley states, Spanish colonization was very kind of urban or city-oriented. And so a lot that which we're familiar with to this day, like alcalde mayor, the mayor, and city council, and so forth, right? And different notions of overlapping jurisdictions of law we get from the Spanish. Not like the Iroquois and others didn't have something similar, but they still brought here in large scale. And then, of course, Hispanic culture, right? So many things pertaining to the Catholic Church to this day with Hispanic culture have been brought over as early as 1599 by Oñate into New Mexico. All right. And so let's see here. And speaking of, let's see here. Well, we're going to get to that soon. So let's go right down the list here for the test. Number 8, giving credit where credit is due. Notice that is found on the last number, I believe number 4 of the Spanish colonization handout, the Black Legend handout. And so basically it's deflection, right? Saying, well, were the English, especially in Virginia, any better? And so you look at things like the abilities of slaves to be able to earn their manumission, their freedom, and pay for their freedom. It seems to have happened arguably in and around the Latin American cities more easily and more naturally than happened up in the English North American colonies. Also, there was a system of accountability, right? The Visitor General and people being put under house arrest, and those underneath them having the opportunity to lay forth any accusations against them for abuse of power. I find nothing of that sort in large scale amongst the English colonies, right? And so that's giving some credit to the Spanish. And then you also had the gracias al sacar notes, and through meritorial service, you could earn a way up that pigmentocracy, right? To be treated as like a criollo, as a pure-blooded Spaniard, I say pure-blooded in quotes, okay? So at any rate, yeah. So something to think about there with number 8. And then Las Casas, right? Las Casas is the guy who really, he got a lot of death threats from the Spaniards themselves. He made a very kind of sharp dichotomy and basically like the first major conflict historian amongst the Spaniards, who contended that the Spaniards came as wolves and as lions and tigers, seeking whom they could devour, and that the poor Native Americans were meek sheep, right? And they were innocent. And that and he had he definitely had a deliberate agenda. He had debates with a guy named Sepulveda back in Spain, whereby he was trying to get the crown, particularly Charles V, also known as Charles I, whichever jurisdiction you're talking about him ruling over, of him passing laws to protect Native Americans. So he became known as the defender of the Indios, of the Native Americans, this Las Casas, okay? So his brief account of the destruction of the Indies was meant to be polemical and to protect Native Americans. And then a little bit on the polar opposite side of that, although not to make it too simplistic, because I think it's a little bit more complex than that, is Castillo. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, number 10 on your test. And remember, he's the one who wrote what he contended was the true history of what happened, contending that Las Casas had distorted things for political reasons. So he's going to write from a Spaniard's point of view as an ex-conquistador who fought alongside Hernan Cortez, and he is going to contend that the Aztec in particular, right, were very all too human, just as capable of imperialism, of deceit, like if you've seen the movie Apocalypto of the Maya and so forth, right? That kind of depiction of a Native American, tribe and people that are anything but meek sheep. And so it reads like a soap opera. And it's translated just simply as the Conquest of New Spain or Conquest of Mexico by Castillo. If you ever want to get your hands on it, it's a very interesting read, to say the least. All right. And then number 11, I chose Sahagún, Sahagun, remember, as symbolic of something bigger than himself. Remember, he's the one that I quoted who helped write the Aztec, translate the Aztec codices into Castilian Spanish. And was very much kind of like an anthropologist, trying to ensure the survival of Aztec heritage and legacy and traditions and so forth, and arts and culture. Nevertheless, right, he's the one who wrote about them sacrificing their children to a rain god and contending that they need to be converted, that the devil had blinded them to do such an infernal deed, and that they needed the light of Christianity to lift the scales from their eyes, so to speak. So even champions like Sahagún, who championed the rights of Native Americans to be, protected from physical violence and from oppression, like Sahagún, they still, by today's standards, right, they ethnocentrically demanded that the Native Americans convert to Catholic Spanish Christianity. All right. And then likewise, along the same controversial lines, number 12, Junipero Serra and the famous 21 missions, right? This guy not too long ago was made a saint in the Catholic Church. And so you have these hagiographies that depict him as a saintly man who endured a lot of privation himself, who went to great lengths to protect his neophytes or his Native American converts on the missions, particularly against abuse from Spanish soldiers at nearby presidios and others. But at the same time, right, they could engage in corporal punishment. If you tried to run away, Senor Vallejo would come after you and try to capture you and bring you back to the mission, because they contended, right, that before God, they were held accountable for your eternal salvation. And they wanted to ensure that you remained for your life in a Catholic Christian atmosphere as your best and perhaps only chance of eternal salvation for your soul after you die. And so, they didn't have classical liberalism until the 1800s with John Stuart Mill and others, right? Who contend, hey, you have your beliefs, I'll have my beliefs, we'll coexist. This was prior to that century, prior to that movement, prior to the Enlightenment, prior to the scientific revolution, for that matter. Well, actually, I take that back. This was the 1770s. So it was actually the Enlightenment. They were right in the middle of the Enlightenment. So at any rate, moving on to number 13, Don Juan de Oñate. I briefly mentioned this before. There's a book called When Jesus Came, the Corn Mothers Went Away by a gentleman named Gutierrez. And it's very much conflict history. It's depicted in such a way that Don Juan de Oñate and others are depicted as very, very power-oriented. That everything they did, including Christianity, etc., was meant to enrich themselves and ensconce themselves in a powerful position at the expense of Native Americans. And of course, right, in the book, it can't take account for every Spanish Franciscan friar and priest that was in New Mexico. Some of them showed signs of being very, very pious and very, very sincere in their religious zeal. But in the book overall, he tends to provide evidence and depict the evidence in such a way that it was a power play. So I personally, having read that book and so forth, I might arguably say that Don Juan de Oñate is a case in point for the Black legend, arguably. Okay, that's a subjective point, but the primary sources depict him in that negative way that the Black legend depicts the Spanish. Okay, as being intolerant, tyrannical, a bit violent, a bit oppressive. And then if you wanted to look into Pope's rebellion, or the rebellion of Santa Fe, New Mexico in 1680, where the Pueblo arose in revolt against the Spanish administration there, it got pretty nasty. All right. Number 14, what are some areas in which the Spanish first claimed territory before the English did? And notice, right, this is an ethnocentric question. The Native Americans claimed this land first, needless to say. But what are some areas? So we talked about 1540 was a huge year. De Soto up the Mississippi. Coronado throughout the Southwest and up into Kansas, arguably. Cabrillo up the California coast. Ponce de Leon before that, and de Narvaez in Florida. But so if I ask you a question about like modern day Massachusetts or the Northeast, no major claim by the Spanish. The only exception is some of the natives knew Basque language from trading arguably with Basque fishermen up in the Massachusetts area, but nothing majorly claimed by Spain in the Northeast. Okay, excuse me. Numbers 16 and 17, right out of your textbook. I believe they're both from chapter 1, right? So, does it contend that French colonization exercised an influence disproportionate to their numbers? On mine, it's chapter 1, and it happens to be on the 15th edition, page 29, the French and the Dutch in America, within chapter 1. And it talks about the runners of the forest. I'm going to butcher that, but the Coureurs des Bois, and the French fur traders, right? And to what extent were they able to exert influence over North America? We know in hindsight, not too much, because we're speaking English and not French. And we know in hindsight that the French did not hold on to the Louisiana territory. But, that's not something that was easily foreseen, perhaps, from the get-go. And so take a look at that from your textbook, okay? Number 17, the textbook claims that rigid royal Spanish policy stifled economic development in the Americas. Just prior to that, on my 15th edition, it is under the Empire at High Tide. Again, chapter 1. On mine, it's page 17 and goes on to page 18. So just read that and see if the textbook states that, because that's a subjective claim, all right? and I just wanted you to check on it in your textbook. All right. So the first 17 we've covered: Native Americans before Columbus and the Spanish colonization. And so I'm going to split this in half, okay, to try to just for my health. And so I'm going to give you a second component to this very soon, numbers 18 through 40, that will pertain to the southern and the northern colonies, as well as the textbook for test number 1. Okay, so again, you just have test 1 to do this week. I apologize for having been gone for the last 5-6 days. I've really been knocked out by my illness. Like I said, I've literally been in the hospital. So I hope you guys are doing well. Canvas message me, and I look forward to hearing your questions. Okay? Thank you, and have a good day, and good luck with this test. All right, bye-bye.